can't say much. I'll explain everything when I get back to the garage. But for right now, I gotta drive back. Thinking about it too, I don't think I've ever done a driving video. That's why they say there's a first time for everything. Even the AM radio works. All the gauges work. The only thing that doesn't work on the truck is the air conditioning. Everything's present except for the condenser. That's it. My name is Mac, and this is my garage. This right here is my 1972 Dodge D200 pickup. It has factory air conditioning. The glove box light works. I even got the cargo light to work. Pretty neat option. This truck isn't perfect by any means whatsoever, but my ultimate goal is to preserve what's here until the time comes at which I can pull it apart and restore it properly back to factory. But enough on that for now. We'll go ahead and talk about the problem that I have today. The issue today is that there really are two issues. The first being that I have a coolant leak that is coming out of the stud. Threaded studs that are on the outer ends of the exhaust manifolds do thread into an open area where a coolant passage is on the head. The second thing that I have to address is a leak that's coming from the front and the back of the intake manifold. It's leaking coolant onto the top of the timing chain cover in the front, and an oil leak that's going past the distributor down the bell housing in the back. I've been putting this off for way too long, and it needs to be addressed now. Before I can address all this, I first have to go back to when I was leaving work, try to figure out how I got here in the first place. Alright, so this is me technically from the past, but edited into the video for convenient timing in the future. I'm gonna go ahead and go to the auto parts store, and we're gonna pick up some coolant and hopefully get this underway. I got the supplies, I'm headed back home now. Back to you, Mac in the garage.
Thanks, Mac in the Mustang, but I have to do a little bit of organizing before I can get the truck in here.
Yeah, a little bit of an upgrade, huh? Change things up from that Pittsburgh jack I've been using over there as the tripod. So forgive the inadequate lighting, but this is as close that I can get the tripod to. I don't have a smaller setup that will allow me to be closer on the top side of the fender. But what I'm going to be doing is I actually had to borrow the nut on the stud from the back of the exhaust manifold. There's two on these outer ends. And what you're going to do is you're going to put both of the nuts on the same thread with the same size wrench. You're going to want to go ahead and tighten them together. They'll be tight against one another so that if they both move, tightening one, you're basically pushing up against the other to either turn in the thread itself or to undo the thread. In this case, I don't have to take off the whole exhaust manifold just to get to it. It's just lightly thread the stud back into the block. The thread, at least in my case, is substantially further back into the block. I tried lining it up just visually with the stud that's on the back end of the motor. So now I can go ahead and undo these. I'm going to go ahead now and put some coolant back into the overflow reservoir that had been taken back by the radiator after the fluid level dropped when it was leaking out of the stud. And I went ahead and put a little bit more in there than probably would be necessary. That it'll probably take majority of that back from the reservoir. We'll fire it up and we'll just check for any leaks. Now, not only is it annoying from a mechanical aspect in the sense that it's another thing that I gotta fix, but also from a visual, just because I'm really trying to keep the vehicle clean and in as good a shape as it can be. So to see then the crystallized dried coolant on the exhaust manifolds that I just had blasted recently and put back on is a little irritating. And after having checked for about 15-20 minutes with the motor running, I can confirm that, at least for now, there is no more coolant that's leaking out of the stud. We should be good for now. The second, and the last, thankfully, being the intake manifold. So I'm going to save this for tomorrow, given the time of day. So I'll see you tomorrow. Oh my gosh, it's not ready yet. Give me a second. Okay, there we go. Wait, what's that sound? Oh, absolutely fantastic. Woke up this morning, found a puddle underneath the truck. Finally got the stud removed. It turns out that we're gonna have to drain the radiator this way. It's gonna be great. Super high-end setup here. I mean, we're talking at least 6 figures. But luckily there's no big chunks. Everything seems to be one solid color. So that's a good sign. I'm gonna put some thread sealer on the stud and put it back in after this drains to where I can clean out that area. Thread sealant. Like so. And we'll drain the rest of the radiator and prepare to take off the intake manifold. Now, if we're lucky, it'll make it actually into the pan. There we go. Yay! Oh man, I really hope I was recording. Started off first by taking off the alternator after undoing the positive and negative battery terminal cables. I want to advise anybody that if you have any trouble putting things back together or not sure how they went, you can always take photos. You can never have enough. After which I removed the air cleaner and got ready to undo all of the fittings and take off the AC compressor. This compressor is interesting in the fact that it's a V-shape with 2 pistons and its own little crankshaft that's run off of the pulley. This thing weighs a ton. Next, it was on to removing the throttle linkage as well as some of the vacuum lines for the carburetor. Had to take off the inlet and the outlet hoses for the heater core, and as well as remove the thermostat and the thermostat housing for the upper radiator hose, while also undoing the fuel line. 4 bolts hold down the carburetor after everything else is detached. Just a couple of vacuum lines to remove out of the way before taking out the coil and removing the positive and negative terminal leads. I was very cautious about removing the nuts that snugged down both leads, as I did not have a towel over the intake. It was going to work out regardless given the fact that I was taking the intake manifold off, but it's always in best practice to cover that.
So, when I'm taking the bolts out, I have this extremely crude drawing of the intake manifold here with the front and the back labeled. That way I know that I can then place the bolts through this piece of cardboard and make sure that I'm taking the bolts out and putting them back in the same spot that they were on the intake manifold.
Climbing up into the engine bay, did I figure out that the final bolt at the back driver's side of the motor was just too close in proximity to the firewall and the distributor that I had to remove the distributor to get to it and to take it out. I'd imagine that I had this issue because of the fact that the truck's firewall being as close to the back of the motor as it was. I can't speak for any other vehicle, but I do know that if the firewall was not as close, these small blocks do have an advantage in the fact that you can take the intake manifold off without having to remove the distributor. Before removing the one bolt that holds in the Y-shaped clip to keep the distributor down into the motor, it is always best to mark where the rotor is pointing as well as where the vacuum advance is pointing on the intake. That way you know which way the distributor is supposed to go back into the motor to get it to fire up and then can dial back in with the timing gun. I would highly advise against the use of using a crowbar to try to pry up the intake manifold. I was able to get by just fine using wedge-style chisels and a hammer. Super heavy intake manifold given the fact that it's cast iron, but I was fortunate enough that my dad came out and helped me put it on the workbench. Next, it was up to taking some paper towel and plugging off ports on the motor. That way, when using the chisel to then scrape off any of the gasket material, it wouldn't go down into any of the oil passages and potentially cause future damage.
Say bye-bye.
Goodbye.
I was very careful to just go around the edges, and I followed it up with some brake cleaner on a towel to then clean the area of any dust or residual residue. Next, it was off to the valve cover gaskets, and I was able to take the intake manifold off by removing the one, but I figured I may as well do both of the valve cover gaskets while I have the one off. So that's exactly what I did.
With the intake manifold off of the motor and on the workbench, we're going to be doing the exact same thing to the underside for the ports as we did with the valve covers and also the old intake gaskets. You're going to want to go ahead and pick up either side. Try to get any loose material off of the old gasket that might be stuck to the actual intake itself.
With the intake manifold cleaned and set aside on the workbench, I then removed the towels that I had placed down to cover the lifter valley to keep gasket material that I had scraped off earlier from falling down into the block, working very carefully to only peel back the edges and to try to pick up all the towels at once. A quick tip is to use a shop vac in which the suction is powerful enough to just pull any of the contaminants out of the port as well as the paper towel.
So the surfaces are clean, everything's vacuumed out. Now we have the ability to put in the new gaskets. I have these gaskets here. These are Felpro. This also comes with a little bag of these retainers, and these help keep the intake gaskets in place. Funny enough that the kit actually came with a second bag, so I'm just going to go ahead and use 4 instead of just the 2 outer retainers. That way I know that the gasket won't move. So here is just a really simple mock-up that I was able to use those retainers, because it really wasn't staying too well with just the outer red ones, but finding the yellow ones worked out pretty well. And then making sure that those cork ones on either end were snugged down. That's what seems to be keeping it all together. So again, this is just a mock-up. I'm gonna go ahead and get the high temp sealant out, and then we'll get this done.
Now, I did not place any gasket material on the actual heads itself, rather just the front side of the intake gaskets, and I did make sure to put an adequate dollop in each corner of the cork gaskets because those seem to be a trouble spot and one of the areas in which I was leaking oil on the back.
So the intake manifold is back on. I'm just gonna go ahead and wipe up any excess of the gasket maker that I had put just around the outside of the seals, but it's on. And now I just have to make sure that the bolt holes are lined up. I tried using enough adequate gasket maker in these corners here at the front and back. That way there will be no leaks. Fingers crossed on that, only God knows. There is a specific bolt pattern in which you torque them down, and you can always look up the information online. I happen to have a Chilton's manual, and it does include the torque specification as well as the bolt pattern to which to tighten down this intake manifold. So I will be following that. And my crudely drawn intake manifold for reference with all of the bolts, so they're going to go back where they initially came from.
Using a simple cardboard diagram like this can help you and save you some time in trying to help the bolts find their proper place of origin. I wanted to get all of the bolts in there initially so that they were all snug, and afterwards, then going with a torque wrench and following the Chilton's manual that I have, was able to torque them down adequately in the proper pattern to 35 foot-pounds.
Having a headache here and there with a bolt or with gaskets, whatnot, but it's finally back on. We're gonna let the gaskets set up overnight. Another thing too is that the valve cover gaskets, which I have to redo both of them, are on back order, and so I will not be able to get them today, and therefore this whole project is going to have to wait. Jump cut to the AC compressor, the alternator, the carburetor, the distributor back in the truck, and then we'll get it all buttoned up, and I'll cut back when everything is good to go.
So, fast forward a couple of days, and I still have yet to put the alternator and the fuel line back onto the motor. I've been holding off in the meantime, but today I did get a call from the auto parts store confirming that they did have in my valve cover gaskets that were on back order. But before I put these on, I'm going to fix an issue that the valve covers have. The area that's around the bolt hole gets pulled down as they are over-tightened and over-torqued, which then creates a great seal specifically around the bolt hole, but not much else around the other flanged end. I don't have a vise that's large enough to be able to secure them so that I can then use a hammer and a dolly to then tap them back down to where they're flush. But I do have a good friend of mine that does. I made a quick phone call and he was more than generous to let me use his vise. So that's exactly what I'm going to go do.
Well, here we are. Everything is back on the motor. The radiator has been burped, and I've tried to work as much of the air out of the system, consistently checking to make sure there's a decent amount of coolant in the reservoir and looking for any air bubbles that show up out of that. The job is done, and I did not have to really use or tweak the distributor. I was able to put it back and the truck fired up immediately, and just using the timing gun to really check where I was at was exactly where I was pulling it out. I do not see any coolant leaking from the front under the timing chain cover or any oil going down the bell housing in the back, which is good. That's what I wanted. But I can't lie. If I told you that this was a simple job, especially towards the latter part, I'd be kidding. Finishing the intake manifold and putting everything back on, it was late at night and I was tired. I'm dumb, but being dumb and tired are two things that do not work well together. And so in my tiredness and my dumbness, I accidentally doubled up a gasket that was on the thermostat housing. So it was just leaking coolant out of that immediately upon filling up the radiator. I had to wait for it to drain back out all over the front of the motor until it got down to where it was level and replaced a gasket. And then it also started leaking a second time out of the bolt on the timing chain cover going through where it secures down this bracket here that's for the power steering pump. I apologize about the poor lighting. I had to wait for the radiator to drain down to that level so that I could pull the entire bolt out and put some high temp thread sealer on it and secure it back down. So in all, I basically had to drain the radiator 2.5, close to 3 times, and before everything finally seated itself and I didn't have any more leaks or coolant. But other than that, that is it. You can leave a comment down below telling me what you liked about the video or what you didn't like about the video. No matter the case, go ahead and tell me down in the comments below. Also, please consider subscribing to the channel. For now, I'm just going to leave you guys with hearing the motor run, hearing how it sounds. And until next time, I will see you guys later. Take care.